He was dying and the ambulance couldn't reach him. That's how this story begins. My neighbor, Mr. Green, a retired firefighter and war veteran, collapsed on his front porch during his morning paper routine, clutching his chest and gasping for air. His wife, panicked and in tears, called 911. The dispatcher assured her help was on the way. Sirens echoed in the distance. But help never reached the driveway. Not because the ambulance didn't try, but because it couldn't. The entire fire lane, the one clearly marked in bright yellow paint, was blocked by white tents, folding chairs, DJ speakers, and a massive inflatable arch that read Happy Sweet 16 Madison. It looked more like a circus than a suburban street. And at the center of it all stood Karen, wearing a tiara, a glitter sash that said Event Queen, and holding a clipboard like she was running a red carpet gala instead of a residential block party. She wasn't just hosting a party. She was commanding a blockade. A literal blockade of emergency access. The paramedics parked as close as they could and sprinted down the sidewalk with their equipment, hopping over coolers and ducking under streamers. One of them tripped over a bucket of ice holding champagne bottles. Another had to argue with a man guarding the party area who thought they were crashing the event. Mr. Green's wife stood at the edge of their yard, screaming for help as music blasted overhead. And Karen stood with her hands on her hips, yelling at the paramedics for stepping on her balloon path. That moment, captured by several phones, was the beginning of the end for Karen's reign of suburban terror. To understand how we got there, you need to know what kind of woman Karen was. Imagine if a wedding planner, a drill sergeant, and a hall monitor merged into one HOI-obsessed tornado of glitter and entitlement. Karen had lived in our neighborhood for 5 years and treated every block like it was her kingdom. She wasn't the president of the HOA, but she might as well have been. She was the loudest voice at every meeting, the one who insisted we needed uniform flower colors in front lawns and once fined a family for hanging Halloween decorations on September 29th. She lived 2 houses down from mine and 3 houses up from the Greens. Her daughter Madison was turning 16, and instead of renting a venue like a normal human being, Karen decided to host a grand event in the neighborhood fire lane. Why the fire lane? Well, as she put it loudly to anyone who questioned her, it's the perfect spot for tents, and there hasn't been an emergency in this neighborhood since the Nixon administration. Those were her exact words. It wasn't just about throwing a party. It was about control. Karen didn't ask permission. She made declarations. She printed fake HOA approval signs, taped off the street with police-style ribbon she bought online, and handed out flyers that said road closed for private function. Some residents were confused. Some were annoyed. But no one dared challenge her directly. Until the sirens came. I was at home when it happened. I just started mowing my front lawn when I saw the flashing lights coming down the street. The music from the party was already shaking the windows, some auto-tuned pop anthem blasting through the neighborhood like a festival. I paused the mower and looked up just in time to see the ambulance stop cold at the start of the fire lane. The paramedics leaned out of the window, trying to wave people aside, but there were tents everywhere. A cotton candy machine. A balloon artist twisting poodles for toddlers. A guy with a beard and man bun who was giving temporary glitter tattoos to middle schoolers. And in the middle of it all was Karen, commanding her domain like a general. The ambulance honked twice. Karen turned slowly and waved them off like they were delivery drivers who'd interrupted her brunch. I stood there, frozen, not sure whether I was watching a bad sitcom or a genuine emergency. Then I saw Mrs. Green running down the sidewalk, barefoot, screaming. She was trying to get someone's attention. Anyone's. I dropped my mower and ran. The next 5 minutes were complete chaos. The EMTs were arguing with Karen. She was saying things like, "I don't see your permit and this is a paid event, you can't just crash." One of the firefighters who arrived moments later tried to move a folding table out of the way and got yelled at by a teenage girl for spilling lemonade. They finally got past the mess by hauling equipment on foot and carrying a gurney sideways between speaker stacks. By the time they reached Mr. Green, precious minutes had passed. I'll never forget the look on his wife's face. That mix of fear and fury. She kept saying he served this country and now he might die because someone wanted a party. Karen stood nearby complaining about the dust being kicked up by the commotion. It didn't take long for things to escalate. As the EMTs worked on Mr. Green and prepared to load him up, a fire truck arrived. Or at least, it tried to. The engine had barely turned onto the street before it stopped short, unable to maneuver around the decorations. One of the archways had collapsed onto the pavement. A cluster of helium balloons got sucked into the fire engine's grill, wrapping around its sirens like festive tentacles. That's when the shouting started. The fire captain got out, took one look at the scene, and pulled out his radio. Karen, still oblivious, marched up to him and demanded he remove his truck because it was blocking her guests' exit photos. He didn't respond. He just walked past her and straight into the chaos. Within minutes, more fire personnel were on the scene. Neighbors began gathering on lawns, phones out, recording. Some were angry, others stunned. A few were trying not to laugh. One guy next to me muttered, "This woman really blocked the fire lane with a popcorn cart." I looked at him and said that cart might end her entire HOA career. That's when a tall man in a dark navy uniform stepped out of a separate unmarked vehicle. He had the insignia of the city fire department and a look that could freeze lava. The fire chief. Karen tried to greet him with a fake smile, but he walked right past her, surveyed the scene, and said in a flat voice, "Who the hell authorized a private event on an emergency access lane?" Karen opened her mouth to speak, then closed it, then opened it again. And that's when the real unraveling began. The fire chief wasn't interested in excuses. He wanted names. He wanted permits. He wanted to know why a man almost died because a suburban block decided to host Coachella Jr. Karen stammered. She tried to blame the HOA president. She said it was just a few tents, that they were temporary, that it was her daughter's special day. The fire chief listened, then asked her if she wanted to come down to City Hall and explain to the mayor why she thought yellow-painted curbs were optional. Karen turned pale. The music was still blaring. Somewhere a fog machine was spraying mist onto a group of confused teenagers. And in the middle of it all, the emergency responders were still trying to back the fire truck out of a maze made of folding tables and balloon arches. The chaos wasn't over. But for Karen, the downfall had officially begun. After the chaos of the blocked fire lane and the near tragedy involving Mr. Green, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. For a place that once prided itself on silence, order, and routine, things had spiraled into absurdity with a speed that no one could have anticipated. The very next morning, the remnants of the disastrous party were still scattered across the street like the aftermath of a storm. Deflated balloons clung to hedges. A folding chair sat abandoned on someone's roof. The scent of burnt hot dogs and spilled soda lingered in the air. And right in the middle of the sidewalk, as if planted there for dramatic effect, was the bent leg of a portable fence pole, now slightly melted from where the fire crew had dropped an emergency flare. Karen, however, didn't see it as a disaster. She called it a hiccup. She dismissed the outrage from neighbors as exaggerated. When someone confronted her about blocking an entire emergency route, she shrugged and said, "Well, nothing bad happened, did it?" To Karen, the story had already ended. She believed the fire chief's appearance was just a formality, something she could smooth over with a phone call and a well-worded apology. But the truth was, the fire chief hadn't left the neighborhood quietly. He'd taken notes. He'd spoken to residents. He'd requested copies of any footage or photos taken during the incident. What Karen didn't realize, what she couldn't comprehend, was that she had underestimated how seriously the city treated fire lane violations, especially when someone nearly died because of it. The chief had also made a call to a contact at City Hall before he even left the neighborhood. That call had set things in motion that Karen would not be able to control. Meanwhile, the HOA president was nowhere to be found. His name was Carl, a soft-spoken man in his 60s who had taken the position mostly because no one else wanted it. Carl had a history of letting Karen take charge because it made his job easier. She handled the paperwork, the event planning, the vendor negotiations. All Carl had to do was sign things and occasionally send out an email. But now, with the city asking questions and neighbors growing louder in their complaints, Carl had chosen to disappear. His car hadn't moved from the garage since the party, and someone claimed to have seen him sneak out through his backyard wearing sunglasses and carrying a duffel bag. With Carl gone and Karen refusing to accept responsibility, the neighborhood found itself in a leadership vacuum. It was in this void that Tanya began to quietly rise. Tanya was the type of neighbor people liked but didn't know well. She was polite, kept to herself, and had a daughter in middle school. Her home was neat, her lawn trimmed, and unlike Karen, she never made a spectacle of anything. But Tanya had one advantage no one else did: a complete, uninterrupted doorbell camera recording of the entire incident. The footage was crystal clear. Every shout, every siren, every second of delay as paramedics tried to maneuver through a jungle of tents and decorations was captured in high definition. At first, she only shared it with a few friends and posted a clip to a local community forum. But the reaction was instant. Within hours, it had been downloaded, reposted, shared in private groups, and sent directly to the city's emergency oversight department. One of Tanya's neighbors suggested uploading it to a broader platform. She hesitated but finally agreed. And that was when things really exploded. The video struck a nerve. Maybe it was the absurdity of a bouncy castle blocking a fire truck. Maybe it was the image of Karen arguing with EMTs while wearing a sash that said Event Queen. Or maybe it was the raw panic on Mrs. Green's face as she screamed for someone to help her husband. Whatever it was, people watched it and then they shared it. By the end of the day, it had hundreds of thousands of views. The local news picked it up. Reporters called it a wake-up call for suburban planning. One anchor referred to the situation as the worst example of HOA overreach they had ever seen. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion, and none of them were kind to Karen. Karen, of course, still thought she could fix everything with a carefully worded social media post. She crafted a long message, full of phrases like unfortunate circumstances and miscommunication with city officials. She ended it with a note about how proud she was of her daughter's milestone and asked for privacy during this challenging time. The post backfired immediately. People flooded the comment section with screenshots, sarcastic memes, and questions like why were tents anchored into the pavement and did the fire truck crash the party or did the party crash public safety. Karen tried to delete the post, but by then it was too late. Screenshots were already circulating. Her attempt at damage control had only added fuel to the fire. Behind the scenes, things were beginning to unravel even faster. The city sent a formal letter requesting the HOA provide documentation on all permits issued for the event. There were none. Karen had printed out what looked like an official approval document, but it was missing any actual city signatures. The city's legal department called it fabricated. They didn't say forged, yet, but the implication was clear. If Karen had knowingly used false documents to justify closing a public lane, she was in serious trouble. The HOA board received a second letter demanding a full audit of funds used for the event. Karen had paid out of pocket for some of the expenses, but there were rumors that she had used HOA discretionary funds to cover miscellaneous expenses, including the rental of the generator and sound system. With Carl still hiding, the rest of the board began scrambling to access financial records and determine if money had been misused. At the same time, Karen began to feel the pressure from the community. Neighbors stopped waving. Children avoided her lawn. The family across the street, once friendly with her, began parking their car on the far side of their driveway to avoid any awkward interaction. Even the dog walkers started crossing the street when they passed her house. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, chilling, and Karen, who thrived on being the center of attention, was beginning to feel the one thing she feared most: irrelevance. The more she tried to reassert control, the more isolated she became. Her group texts were ignored. Her social invites went unanswered. The gossip around her shifted from shock to dismissal. But the final blow came when a surprise visit from the fire chief and a city safety inspector showed up at her doorstep. It wasn't an arrest. Not yet. But it was official. They wanted to walk the street again, take photos, make note. Karen tried to offer coffee. They declined. She asked if they needed anything. They asked for access to her property records, including her communication with Carl. She said she'd get back to them. They said they'd wait. It was a quiet confrontation, the kind that didn't involve handcuffs but left behind something heavier, a silence that echoed louder than any siren. As they walked away, the fire chief turned and said something Karen didn't expect. He looked her in the eyes and said, "Do you remember what it felt like watching someone die because they couldn't be reached in time?" Karen didn't answer. She couldn't. Because for all the excuses and speeches, she had no defense against the truth. And the truth was now bigger than her. It was in the headlines, in the meeting halls, in the voices of her neighbors. And soon, it would be in courtrooms too. The next morning, the neighborhood woke up not just to the hangover of a botched party, but to something far worse: headlines. Tanya, the quiet neighbor 3 houses down from Karen, had uploaded the entire ordeal to her social media. The video, spliced with timestamps and overlaid text like "EMTs blocked by bouncy castle" and "fire lane," more like photo lane, had gone viral overnight. She hadn't even meant to post it publicly at first. She was just venting. But it got shared, then reshared, and then it hit Reddit. From there, it spread like wildfire. Local news stations picked it up by sunrise. The fire chief himself had commented on the thread anonymously, confirming that yes, this was very real and yes, someone might actually face charges. Tanya's doorbell footage, along with cell phone clips from multiple neighbors, painted a disastrous picture. Karen could be seen arguing with first responders. She was recorded complaining about the aesthetic damage caused by a fire hose. At one point, she tried to pose for a photo with her daughter while emergency personnel worked 10 feet away from her. The footage wasn't just embarrassing. It was incriminating. Karen's downfall wasn't going to be a quiet one. It was going to be televised, memed, and documented from every angle. By mid-morning, a city inspector showed up unannounced. He didn't even knock on doors. He just walked down the lane with a clipboard, pausing at the yellow curb paint, jotting notes, occasionally shaking his head. Shortly after that, another vehicle arrived. This one bore the emblem of the state fire marshal's office. Out stepped a woman in a dark gray suit with sharp sunglasses and an even sharper tone. She asked to speak to the HOA president and vice president. The HOA president was nowhere to be found. He was reportedly out of town, which was code for hiding. Karen, on the other hand, came out in full makeup, acting as if she had been expecting them. She greeted the marshal with a plastic smile, holding a tray of leftover cupcakes from the party. The marshal didn't even look at the tray. She handed Karen a thick folder instead. Inside were photos taken during the event. Violations were marked in red. A fire pit under a cloth tent. A generator propped up against a wooden fence. Open alcohol containers near underage guests. Tents anchored into the pavement using makeshift stakes that pierced into city utility lines. One tent had been tied to a stop sign. Another had blocked a hydrant. Karen laughed nervously and tried to explain it all away. She claimed it was a surprise celebration, and she had no idea how the setup got that extensive. The marshal replied dryly that surprise isn't a legal defense, and the fire department doesn't do favors for tiaras. Then she asked a question Karen wasn't ready for. Who approved this event? Karen pointed to the HOA president, conveniently absent. The marshal raised an eyebrow. Any written approval? Karen hesitated. She said there might be emails. Maybe a text. The marshal asked to see them. Karen blinked. Her confidence started to melt. She said she'd have to check her phone. While Karen tried to scramble through her inbox, something unexpected happened. A girl from the party, no older than 10, wandered up to the marshal and asked if she was there to make sure nobody gets hurt next time. The marshal squatted down and said calmly yes, that's exactly why she was there. The girl pointed at the balloon remains still tangled in a tree and said her dad, who was a firefighter in another city, had told her never to block fire lanes, not even with cones. The marshal gave a tight smile and said some people needed to be reminded of that. Karen heard it all from a few feet away. She didn't say a word. For the first time in years, Karen didn't have a comeback. She just stood there, clutching her phone, hoping none of the adults around her noticed her hands trembling. But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. Because while Karen was fumbling with excuses, a third vehicle pulled up. It belonged to the zoning department. A man stepped out carrying rolled blueprints. He said he was there to inspect a temporary fence erected during the party. Karen's face drained of color. That fence had been her idea. She had it set up to create a perimeter around the party to keep out nosy neighbors and non-invitees. It was one of those foldable temporary construction fences, rented from a supplier downtown. The problem was, she had placed it across a city-maintained emergency exit path, one that was supposed to remain unobstructed at all times. The inspector asked if she had submitted a temporary structure permit. Karen tried to claim ignorance. She said she thought it didn't count as a structure. He replied that anything taller than 4 feet blocking a right-of-way absolutely counted. Neighbors began to gather again, this time not out of curiosity but out of a sense of vindication. For years, Karen had ticketed people for leaving trash bins out too long, for having wind chimes that were too loud, or for parking tires half an inch over the curb. Now she stood there under investigation by 3 different city agencies, being picked apart like a science fair project gone horribly wrong. Tanya stepped out from her porch and, without a word, set up a lawn chair. She opened a can of soda and just watched. Karen looked in her direction for a moment and then looked away quickly. Tanya was no longer invisible. She was the quiet storm that had triggered the avalanche. Then came the most poetic twist. One of the guests from the party, a man Karen had introduced the night before as her cousin from out of town, was standing on the sidewalk talking to the fire marshal. It turned out he wasn't just some out-of-town cousin. He was a building inspector from a neighboring county, and he'd been appalled by the setup. When asked for his opinion, he gave a blunt assessment of what he saw: multiple fire hazards, code violations, and potential criminal negligence if the delayed response had worsened Mr. Green's condition. Karen overheard him and rushed over to whisper that he didn't need to get involved, it wasn't his jurisdiction. The man simply replied that public safety didn't care about zip codes and walked away. The city was now fully engaged. Karen's house became a point of scrutiny. Multiple agencies began combing through the HOA's records, looking for signs of approval, funds used for unauthorized expenses, and any indication of liability shielding. The neighbors had questions too. Who paid for the event setup? Were HOA funds used for decorations or rentals? Why was the fire lane so casually violated, and who else knew? The HOA president issued a vague statement via email saying they were cooperating with authorities. Karen, however, issued no statement. Her silence was a wall, and behind it, she was bracing for the storm. But the wall was already cracking. As the sun set that evening, Tanya's video had hit national news. Hashtags were trending. Karen's name was being attached to memes. News anchors were referring to the event as the Fire Lane Fiesta. Clips of her shouting at firefighters were being paired with circus music and racked up millions of views. What had been a local scandal was now an internet spectacle. Karen had always wanted attention. Now she had it. Just not the kind she could control. By the following week, the tone of the neighborhood had shifted entirely. There was no more tolerance, no more pretending. Karen had become the center of a firestorm she could no longer smother with her usual charm, threats, or manipulation. What once would have been brushed off as just another one of her stunts had now escalated into something much bigger, something legal, something unstoppable. The city's patience had worn thin, and so had the community's. On Monday morning, the first formal citation arrived. Not a warning, a fine. Stacked with it was a detailed list of violations: obstruction of emergency services, unauthorized event without permit, temporary structures in a public right-of-way, and the most damning of all, endangerment due to willful interference during a medical emergency. Karen stood on her front porch in slippers and a satin robe as the city official handed her the envelope. She didn't say a word, just stared at it like she couldn't believe paper could weigh that much. The news didn't stop there. City Hall held a press conference that afternoon. The fire chief himself stepped forward, calmly detailing the timeline of events during the blocked emergency. He didn't mention Karen by name, but he didn't need to. He spoke about a systemic disregard for public safety and how communities needed to be reminded that fire lanes were not optional. A reporter asked if criminal charges were being considered. He said it was under review. The air around the neighborhood thickened. This wasn't just about party tents anymore. This was about someone almost dying and the city getting embarrassed on a national scale. The pressure to act was enormous, and Karen could feel it pressing down on her from every direction. To make matters worse, the HOA board scrambled into damage control. After years of letting Karen run wild because she was loud, confident, and frankly intimidating, they were now racing to distance themselves from her. The HOA president, who had conveniently disappeared during the initial fallout, re-emerged at a hastily organized community meeting. He stood in front of a folding table at the clubhouse, sweating through his polo shirt as residents grilled him about signatures, approvals, and financial records. When asked to approve the event in writing, he hesitated, then said that Karen had shown him a typed sheet claiming everything was cleared. When pressed further, he admitted he never verified it. The room exploded. People who had once kept their heads down now raised their voices. One man shouted that his disabled mother couldn't leave their home that night because the fire lane was blocked. Another said his sprinkler system had been damaged when the temporary fence was installed without notice. A third stood up and asked the question on everyone's mind. How much longer are we letting her pretend this place is her kingdom? Karen didn't attend that meeting, but she heard about it within the hour. Word traveled fast now, and there were screenshots, videos, and voice notes flying across group chats and neighborhood forums. Tanya, the quiet neighbor who had started all of this, was now viewed as a local hero. People brought her cookies. Someone even sent her flowers anonymously with a card that read "Keep filming." Meanwhile, Karen shut her curtains and didn't answer the door. She stayed offline, and offline for someone like Karen was worse than jail. Her social life was built on digital image and manufactured status, and now all of it was crumbling. The Facebook group she once moderated was now flooded with memes about fire lanes and cupcake disasters. A petition to remove her from any official HOA capacity had reached over 200 signatures in just 2 days. Even the kids from Madison's party had started turning on her. One parent posted a message saying their child was traumatized after being interviewed by a fire investigator. Another said their daughter was embarrassed to be seen in the viral videos, especially since Karen kept shouting about guests of honor, as if she were running a red carpet event. By midweek, the HOA board announced a mandatory community fire drill. It was a PR move, organized with the city to show good faith and reinforce emergency readiness. Flyers went out, reminding residents of the importance of keeping access lanes clear and reporting violations. Karen's name wasn't mentioned, but the subtext was obvious. The event would be held on the same street where the party had taken place. There would be a fire truck, EMTs, safety volunteers, even a food truck offering free water and snack. Tanya was asked to assist as a community liaison. She agreed, under one condition: that the fire chief be invited. The board, nervous but desperate for redemption, agreed. On the day of the drill, the mood was surreal. Neighbors gathered on lawns. Kids wore plastic firefighter helmets handed out by the department. The same street that had once been jammed with party decor was now lined with cones, flags, and safety signage. The fire chief arrived exactly on time, shook hands, took photos, and walked the path where the ambulance had been blocked days earlier. He pointed out potential hazards, praised the new signage, and answered questions from residents. Then, without warning, he stood on the back of the fire truck and asked if he could say a few words. The crowd hushed. Cameras rolled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He talked about how minutes matter, how access isn't a suggestion, how communities are built on trust, and how quickly that trust can be broken when someone decides their event matters more than someone else's life. He never mentioned Karen, but everyone knew. Karen watched from behind her blinds. She didn't come outside. She didn't speak. Her world, once so loud, had gone silent. Her daughter Madison hadn't spoken to her since the video went viral. Her husband had quietly moved out for a while, allegedly staying with his brother across town. The fire chief finished his speech, and the crowd applauded. One of the younger kids turned to his dad and asked if that was the guy who saved Mr. Green. The dad nodded. The kid said, "Cool, I want to be like him." No one mentioned the tiaras. No one talked about Karen's decorations. The street was no longer her stage. It now belonged to the people who had earned it. Just as the crowd began to disperse, Tanya stepped forward with something rolled under her arm. She unfurled a banner and clipped it to the HOA notice board. It read, "Always leave the lane clear. Lives depend on it." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But it hit harder than anything Karen had ever posted in her life. People stopped to read it, some nodded quietly, others took pictures. Karen saw it through the window and slumped into the couch, covering her face with her hands. She wasn't just dealing with consequences. She was watching her power dissolve. That evening, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter. Safer. Conversations that had once been whispers became open discussions. People were exchanging numbers, offering help, organizing cleanup crews, and reinforcing community bond. The memory of that awful day wasn't gone, but it was being reshaped into something useful. Something educational. Karen's name became less important than the lesson learned. But for her, the lesson was far from over. Because while the neighborhood had chosen to move forward, the legal system was just getting started. And the next envelope she would receive wouldn't come with a fine. It would come with a summons. The envelope that arrived on Friday morning didn't come with a city seal or a warning notice. It came from a law firm. Thick, serious, and certified. Karen had to sign for it, and even the delivery guy looked uncomfortable handing it over. She closed the door slowly, the envelope clutched in her hands like it was a ticking time bomb. And in a way it was. Because it wasn't just a lawsuit, it was three. The first was from Mr. Green's family, citing endangerment and delay of emergency services during a life-threatening episode. The second was a class action suit filed by several neighbors over unauthorized use of HOA funds and illegal obstruction of public infrastructure. The third came from the state fire marshal's office, and that one didn't mince words. It accused Karen of willful negligence, interference with emergency personnel, and violation of state fire code, including provisions that carried potential criminal penalties. Karen stood in her kitchen staring at the paperwork while her phone vibrated nonstop on the counter. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She had no defense left. The days of tiaras and clipboards were gone. Now she needed a lawyer. By the weekend, the story had reached national media. One of the bigger news networks ran a segment titled Fire Lane Fiasco and featured clips from Tanya's doorbell cam, interviews with the fire chief, and even a brief statement from Mr. Green's daughter. She spoke directly to the camera and said her father nearly died because someone thought decorations were more important than dignity. The host ended the segment by saying the case had become a benchmark for new legislation being proposed at the local level. They were calling it Karen's Law, and it would triple the penalties for anyone who blocked emergency access routes in residential zones. Karen's name had become law. But not the way she'd imagined. Not the way she wanted. The HOA board held an emergency vote the following Tuesday. They had received overwhelming pressure from the community to remove Karen from her vice president role and bar her from all decision-making processes. The meeting was packed. Neighbors who'd never attended before came and stood shoulder to shoulder in the community center. The vote wasn't close. It was unanimous. Karen was officially stripped of her role. When the board president announced the result, the room didn't cheer. It didn't boo. It just exhaled. A long breath of relief, like a storm had finally passed. Karen wasn't present at the meeting, but she'd been watching from her car in the parking lot. When the results were posted on the bulletin board, she quietly drove away. But the neighborhood wasn't done healing. A week after the vote, they organized a new event. Not a party, not a celebration, but a community safety day. The goal was simple: rebuild trust, educate residents, and demonstrate that people here cared about each other. The fire department partnered with the HOA, minus Karen, to put on demonstrations. There were mock drills, fire extinguisher training, CPR booths, and food stalls run by volunteers. The turnout was massive. Tanya was honored with a small award for civic responsibility, which she accepted with a shy smile and a nervous wave. Kids took pictures on the fire truck. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years shared hot dogs and stories. The fire chief gave another speech, shorter this time, more personal. He talked about what could have happened, what nearly did, and why it never should have. Then he looked out at the crowd and said, "Sometimes the loudest voice isn't the wisest one." That line stuck with everyone. Just before the event ended, a group of teens rolled out a canvas banner they'd painted together. It showed a simple message, one now embedded in the community's DNA. Keep the lane clear. Save a life. It was hung across the main street and lit up at night by solar-powered lamp. Residents took turns posting pictures with it. The banner even got its own hashtag. Tanya's footage continued to circulate, not as a spectacle anymore, but as an educational video used in community training programs. Several cities requested copies. The video that once humiliated the neighborhood had now become its shield. Karen, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale. She no longer held HOA power. She rarely appeared outside during daylight. Her house, once the hub of holiday events and glittery brunches, was quiet and still. The decorations were gone. The fake approval signs had been taken down. The fence she had erected was dismantled by city order. Her husband had filed for separation, citing irreconcilable public embarrassment. Madison had moved in with her grandparents across town, needing space to recover from the ridicule that came with being the face of an infamous disaster. Karen was alone now, not because she was punished, but because no one trusted her anymore. Her empire of control had crumbled from the inside out. But there was one final twist. A few days after the Community Safety Day, a man in a suit knocked on Tanya's door. He introduced himself as a representative from a regional emergency planning agency. They were developing a public awareness campaign and wanted to feature Tanya's footage and her personal story. They offered a speaking stipend. Tanya was shocked, flustered, and insisted she wasn't a public person. The man told her that sometimes the people who don't seek the spotlight are the ones who make the biggest difference. After some hesitation, she agreed. Not for the money, but because she realized something important. Silence hadn't protected the neighborhood. Speaking up had. Karen tried to file a cease and desist against the campaign. Her lawyers sent a letter demanding Tanya remove her footage. But by then, it was too late. The footage had been archived, shared, and distributed to government safety portals. The letter was ignored. The city issued a public response stating that once an incident occurs in a public safety emergency, footage relevant to the event becomes a matter of public record. Karen's threats, like her authority, carried no weight anymore. In the months that followed, the neighborhood changed. Slowly, but meaningfully. People were kinder, more cooperative. The HOA board added 2 new members with backgrounds in safety planning. Annual fire drills became routine. Decorative street events had to go through an actual approval process. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And when new families moved in, they were greeted not with silent glares but welcome baskets and phone numbers of nearby neighbors. The stain left by Karen's reign had begun to fade. But the lessons she accidentally taught remained crystal clear. Karen eventually sold her house, though it sat on the market for months. She moved out in the dead of night, not even leaving a forwarding address. Her name still came up occasionally, mostly in jokes or when someone brought up HOA policy. But for the most part, she became a ghost. The neighborhood moved on, and so did the city. Karen had blocked a fire lane for attention. What she got was a legacy she could never erase. And the lane she once claimed for herself now stood as a symbol of the very community she underestimated. No tiaras, no tent, just one freshly painted yellow curb, and a city that would never ignore it again.